This is a discussion about the early Wailers. As I said in a previous lecture, one can divide Mali's career into essentially three parts. I would say during his life, there were two parts to his career. One could sort of nuance all of that into pockets that are related to the chronology of his life. But in terms of his recording career, we could argue that from 1962, when he first records One Cup of Coffee and Judge Not um, at Beverly Studios, until 1971, when he then signs up with uh, Island Records with Chris Blackwell. Um, that's the early period of Bob Marley. Now, that early period went through a number of transitions, and it's worth paying attention to. And of course, beginning in 1971, 72, we then get the albums that begin to be produced, beginning with Catch a Fire, then Burning, then Natty Dread, and Rastaman Vibrations, Exodus, Babylon by Bus, which was a live album, and of course Bob Marley Live. Uh, and then we get Exodus, and we get Kaya, and then we have Survival, Uprising. There's that there's that period. And Marley dies in 1981. So we get these basically 10 years between careers. And I want to spend some time talking a little bit about the early career. And the early career, the Wailers, as we know them, were an interesting group of young people who who came together um, in Trench Town, where Marley had moved to live with his mother. Marley was a 16-year-old boy, 15-year-old boy. He had been to school. He had also attempted to be an apprentice with a welding outfit, and he got injured very soon after he took on this apprenticeship position, and so he gave it up. He was injured in the eye, and so Marley was essentially roving the streets, very interested, of course, in music. And it was a blooming time for music in Kingston, especially in Trenchtown at that time. And there was an interest in recording Jamaican artists. Something about the history of Jamaican music would tell you a little bit, the Jamaican recording industry would tell you a little bit about why those early 60s became very interesting and dynamic times. Much of Jamaican music prior to the 1960s, the late 50s and the 1960s, was purloined through through live music, not unlike and not in contradiction with the live big band movement that consumed the United States from the 1920s up until the 50s. But the big band was a very present phenomena in Jamaica at that time. And many of the artists who would be the musicians, who would go on to be studio musicians and, of course, be major musicians in the 1960s, had their beginnings as side musicians, as part of big band groups. And they were playing jazz, they were playing rock and roll, early rock and roll, of course. They were playing bop, they were playing dance music. And these bands formed a very interesting part of the Jamaican culture. At the same time, there existed another kind of music form called mento, which is more homegrown. It was a Jamaican music form, not unlike calypso, but quite distinctive, very local, very rural in its taste and its fashion, but very interestingly, very risque in the lyrics. And there were songs like Soldering and so on. But it became kind of folk-based music. But the rhythms that they created and that they were sort of given birth to would then slowly begin to influence the more urban sound that would emerge. So what begins to happen, of course, is that, that there's a period where these bands are performing throughout the country, and they're creating these dances, and these dances would be outdoor dances on the lawn, as they say. Um, and an interesting development, of course, was that there was a costliness to this big band movement, and so as technology began to improve, the vinyl record began to become very current, and especially jazz music, which was of great interest to young people in Jamaica in the 1940s and the 1950s. That interest began to sort of evolve into the establishment of disco situations. That is, there'd be music played on records that people will dance to, and these dances would then be part of the lifestyle and the entertainment world of Jamaica at that time. Now, this is very interesting because that is the beginning of the dancehall movement, and we know the dancehall movement to be one of the sort of early precursors to hip hop and so on and so forth. But the dancehall movement, which would lead to dub, which would lead to reggae and so on, began in the 1950s. And it began where there was the dance hall, literally a dance hall where people danced to music. Many interesting people would emerge at that time, and these were real entrepreneurs, and these were men, largely men who were very interested in making money, by throwing these dances through Jamaica. And so they would create what we call sound systems. And that's when the technology, as a necessity, began to get more sophisticated. The building of sound systems, which would mean amplification, which would mean the development of boxes, massive speaker boxes, and then a range of speaker boxes from the tweeter to the sort of the sort of guttural bass, to create a sound that was both loud but also sumptuous. And in many ways, what we know of the emergence of Marshall amps and all of those things, the amplification of music that would really explode in the 60s and the 70s, had its beginnings in terms of the technology in Jamaican culture. And this is really important and very interesting. And so many of these individuals began to set up these systems, which were called sound systems, and they would clash with each other. They would be bands, in competition with each other, and they would slowly eclipse the live band, the big band, because they were less expensive, because they were more mobile, because they were more efficient, essentially, because they employed very few people. And what would you need for that? You'd need a great sound system. You'd need strong young men to carry boxes, speaker boxes, and setup. And then you would need a DJ, somebody who would be the engineer, the person who would mix the music and play the albums and so on and so forth. And slowly to encourage people to dance, to sort of be the toaster, to say, everybody get up and dance, move, and so on and so forth, and to intersperse the live music, the recorded music with live sound. We then get a figure who would now be called a DJ, but would in fact be the person who is speaking and encouraging people. And then there'll be, of course, the sound guy and the mixer, and the one who would be the one mixing the music and playing it. And the DJ then would be the speaker. And so there were early DJs who were just men who encouraged the dance, interspersed the music that was being played. And then you need albums, you need records. And most of those records were from the United States. Many of them were sourced in Florida, and then, of course, in New Orleans. And there was a very great deal of interest in that music, which was really the emergence of black music, the blues, especially jazz, and to a large extent country music, which would be relevant to Bob Marley and the Wailers as well, the early country music. So these songs would be played in the dance hall and so on. Well, something very interesting happened, and this is one of the stories that was told by Cox and Dodd and a number of the other producers who began at that time, and these were tough guys. These were sort of guys who had to protect themselves. They were armed and so on and so forth. They were colorful individuals. So it was a working class phenomena. It was of interest to the daring middle classes and so on and so forth, but it was seen as low culture, low grade culture, and not seen as anything of high quality and high cultural value. But it was also being incredibly innovative and would eventually become sort of the groundswell of an indigenous kind of music movement. Sometime in the mid 50s, they began to have difficulty um, uh, importing these records. Uh, Difficulty getting to the States, difficulty bringing them in, and so on and so forth. And this shortage was very important because, of course, it meant that these bands that would be competing with each other, trying to see who had the newest record, were struggling to find new music, and this is what began to make people be interested in recording these dub plates, these vinyl plates, just for the dance hall, and they became locally recorded. And so a number of studios, a number of radio stations began to use their studios for the purpose of creating these plates. And these plates would then be taken to dance halls and they'll be played and they'll be specials. They were not for public consumption and they were not available to everybody. And so what you begin to have happening is the emergence of a recording industry, but the recording industry is designed to feed the dance hall. So we're not talking about a recording industry as it was operating in the United States, where you recorded, you pressed thousands of records, and you sold them, and you had a business. What you had was the pressing of a single plate, and that plate would then be carried around, and it would be in competition. And so there begins to be a burgeoning recording industry in Jamaica, and that industry would really become important to the development and the arrival of artists like Bob Marley and the Wailers. In the second part of this discussion, which will be in the next video, I will talk a little bit about how Bob Marley himself becomes involved in that recording movement, and then, of course, how we begin to see the emergence of the Wailers.